Hello everyone, welcome to today's event. So if you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute for the time being. Just going to let a few more people in and then we'll get started very shortly. Okay, so welcome today to today's event on non-human photography. This is a talk by Rebecca Najdowski and Rhona Clews, which explores entanglement between humans, nature, and photographic materiality. Rebecca Najdowski is a Melbourne-based artist whose work engages with the material and political implications of representing nature through photographic technologies. By focusing on optics, light, minerals, time and chemical, and digital interactions, her projects embody such essential components of photomedia in order to expose the conditions of representation. Rebecca's work has addressed desert ecology, botanical specimens, natural phenomena like the use of the sun, geothermal activity and rain, and imaginings of the universe. She holds a PhD from Victorian College of the Arts, University of Melbourne, and an MFA from California College of the Arts. Based on her recent practice-led PhD research, her talk delves into artwork that addresses how nature is envisioned through photography, video, and scanning technology. With a focus on material agency, her practice looks at how humans, nature, and photomedia technology are inherently entangled. In this talk, she will highlight projects made by directly exposing photomaterials to natural phenomena like geothermal activity, photographs created through haptic manipulations of conventional landscape imagery, and digital 3D scans of flora. Her aim through this work is to undermine the limiting features of photomedia, to draw attention to them, and to open up new perspectives on nature. We'll then hear from Rhona Clews, whose creative practice draws upon the past of growing up as a hippie to generate understandings between human and more than human worlds. Working across writing, photography, performance, and film, she blends ecofeminism with fiction, humour, SF, and trauma theory. Enacting her longing for planetary interconnectedness through absurd quests, she rubs up against and clambers inside other bodies she encounters, merging human, non-human, cosmos, and ecology. With a dual background in psychology and photography, she is an MFA graduate from the Slade School of Fine Art and a healer therapist in trauma and addiction. She exhibits widely, co-curates and teaches expanded photography, poetry, and writing. And this is a quote from Rhona, whether melting my body into the innards of my home photocopier, filming erupting geyser postcards found on eBay, or crawling on my belly to enter macro pollen perspectives, she will discuss the myriad of experimental photographic approaches she uses to collapse ecological distance. Drawing on her training as a psychologist and psychic, she resituates photography into an expanded eco-feminist somatic practice led by feeling, sensation, and mutuality. From converting night back into the dark room to cuddling her limbs with light-sensitive material, her talk reclaims the photographic as a dynamic space for spontaneous human, more than human exchange. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Rebecca, who will start her presentation.
Okay. Great, thanks for having me. Hopefully you can see my screen all right. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from where I live, work, and create, which is on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people. I'm here as an uninvited guest, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And so today I'm going to show you some work from my recently completed PhD project from the Victorian College of the Arts. And I just want to set up a few ideas before I kind of get into the actual artwork. So just bear with me a little bit, please. So the creative research really grew out of kind of a frustration with the representational limitations of landscape and nature photography. And I'll dive into that a little bit more. I do use this word photomedia quite a lot in my work. I'm using the term to describe technologies and processes that deal with the recording of light, like photography, video, and 3D scanning. And in my practice, I'm particularly interested in how materiality of photomedia can be kind of harnessed and opened up to new conceptual understandings and uses. So through projects that focus on optics, light, minerals, time, and chemical and digital interactions, I'm kind of trying to expose the conditions of representation within the materiality of photomedia. And I consider what I'm doing both a celebration and also a critique of imaging technologies. And then I also want to just mention here that kind of avoiding and refraining from locating geographically or identifying these works. And that's because I want to kind of turn away from the human categorization of naming and turn more towards the forces of natural phenomena and also the agencies of the environments that I'm working with. All right, so for a bit of context, let's see, I wanted to just put up this quote by Robert Macfarlane here, who recognizes that the proposed time period in which humans have become a geologic force, which is the Anthropocene, that it asks hard questions of artists. And he notes that literature and art are confronted with particular challenges by the idea of the Anthropocene. Old forms of representation are experiencing drastic new pressures and being tasked with daunting new responsibilities. So I kind of see what I'm doing as being a bit related to this idea of kind of renegotiating representations. And I'm thinking that I'm of myself as being involved in a process of reconfiguring representation of nature, which I'll kind of get into a bit more shortly. So it's clear that the climate crisis has created a very palpable need to conceptualize nature differently. I think we all kind of know that. And from that perspective, my research is kind of concerned with how nature is then envisioned through photomedia, and then how in turn that perception shapes our interaction with the world around us. So today I'll show you 3 projects that came out of the PhD research. Each one was a different way to approach and address the question that I had for the research, which was, how can photomedia, a tool for framing and objectifying and abstracting nature, then be undermined to imagine new relationalities between culture, technology, and more than human nature? So now that I've covered a little bit of the context, I want to get into the actual work and talk about Ambient Pressure, which is a series that directly deals with this kind of framing of nature through landscape photography. This is the project installed for my thesis exhibition in Melbourne at Margaret Lawrence Gallery. And in this section of the gallery, there were 60 prints and 3 videos on monitors presented in the space. But this is really kind of the starting point of this work, I would say. And it's, I'm kind of grappling with the fact that photography is sort of complicit in framing nature as something that's separate from humans by the way that it kind of objectifies nature. And, you know, really I sort of see our perception of nature as being filtered through these photographic representations that continually reinforce cultural conventions. And it seems to me that, you know, with a simple Google search like this one that we're seeing here for landscape photography, you can kind of see some similarities across the different photographs. They're often very sublime, bright jewel tones, and most of the locations are untouched by humans or appear to be untouched by humans. And so, excuse me, I'm a little under the weather. So, with this kind of photography, I think what comes about is dominant conventions that tend to aestheticize environments in a way that leaves out any of the socio-ecological or political concerns. And then that's kind of coupled with issues that photomedia really appears often to be this neutral and transparent window into the world. So I think that this quote by philosopher Timothy Morton kind of captures the objectification and distancing taking place photography has contributed to, and which I'm trying to kind of push up against a bit. And he talks about nature with a capital N, saying that just like a reflection, we can never actually reach it and touch it and belong to it. Nature was an ideal image, a self-contained form suspended afar, shimmering and naked behind glass, like an expensive painting. I really like that quote. I think it's very evocative. And for me, it kind of connects this idea of, or really the kind of concept of nature itself, our idea of nature with a constructed representation. So the work that I'm showing you here really kind of came out of feeling compelled to directly probe these conventional landscape images as a way of addressing representation and conceptualization of nature. And so I looked for ways to kind of unsettle materially and also conceptually like actual representational structures of both film and prints. And from that, I started to go into my archive of images and photos I've taken in years past depicting nature. And I use those pre-existing, pardon me, those pre-existing medium format images as the starting point. And I would efface their structure in different ways by cutting and marking and burning and folding and adding other manipulations to give a sense of additive erasure. And then as it developed further, I started to create images where I physically altered photographic prints and also scanned film with overlaid objects like you're seeing in this slide here. And then I also was interested in seeing kind of where I could take this in a more kind of temporal space. And so I made a few different video pieces like this one here, where I'm kind of sort of taking what I did in 2D form and moving it into a moving image space. And all of these strategies together formed a series with moving images, still images, incorporating various forms of haptic intervention into the like actual materiality of this landscape photo media. And with these, I was trying to interrupt an actual and also metaphorical frame within the photo media. I wanted to try to draw attention to its existence in some way. And I wanted the objectness of the artworks to be revealed through the manipulation. So I wanted it to become a bit more difficult to view them as sort of like windows onto an environment, and instead point more toward the fact that photography is a construction. Through the process of disrupting the nature images, I tried to fracture the logic of the photographic frame as something that's neutral and invisible. And so my methods were influenced by non-representational research. I was interested in that because it offers kind of different ways of seeing research. And I'm going to use the words of theorist Philip Vanini here. He says that non-representational research styles seek to, quote, render rather than represent, to resonate rather than validate, to rupture and reimagine. So to me, this just made a lot of sense for what I was doing. The techniques that I use to make the ambient pressure works are pretty experimental, and I'm also using lots of different materials with the photography. So I use blades and lighters, markers, plastic, rocks, bleach, other materials, and I choose what sorts of marks and ruptures and overlays based on the original landscape image. And I think of these as being composed of twice. So there's the first, moment where it's composed when I'm capturing it in film for the first time. And then when I manipulate the film and scans and prints later in the studio. And in that second stage of composition, I'm really considering what ways I can modify that framing structure. I want to kind of see how I can draw attention to the fact that ultimately the photograph basically sits on a thin surface. And so what kind of marks and abrasions and obstructions could I add that might highlight that material construction? And I also looked for ways that I could create effective resonances, so to speak, between pre-existing landscape images and then my manipulations by paying attention to the possibilities of kind of shared or contrasting patterns. And then I also was really kind of attempting to avoid too much of a fixed system across the series. So each image, I attempt to make something a little bit different and use different processes and materials. And excuse me, the methods and techniques that I'm using are trying to basically bring this problem of representational construct into kind of new light. By using that pre-existing landscape imagery, I was essentially working within representation itself in order to critique it. And those marks and ruptures and objects give shape to the construct of representation, which I think paradoxically can often seem almost invisible, partly because it's so kind of woven into the fabric of everyday life. The title Ambient Pressure comes from the term that describes the pressure of a medium which surrounds an object. And I found that this was kind of a fitting title for the project because the work is fundamentally concerned with this kind of heaviness or the weightiness of nature representation. But ambient pressure also connects to the process of making the work, where there's physical tension used to create these tangible ruptures in the photographic surface as well. And with this work and the manipulations to the photomaterials, I'm hoping that it might make visible the constructs of representation and also the kind of conceptualizing that we humans engage in when we're sort of thinking about nature through media. And then I'm also sort of thinking about how these material disruptions could be metaphorically kind of related to physical manifestations of how humans are within the environment that we're occupying. So from resource depletion and land displacement to pollution. All right. So another part of the PhD research was a series called Surfacing. And this explores the possibility of, a different way to undermine the pictorial element of photography with this project. I thought of it as a way to kind of rethink how environments are represented photographically. So I was attempting to kind of bring in the more than visual aspects of the earth into the image making process to create cameraless artworks. And surfacing began as I explored ways of generating material encounters between the light sensitive film and paper and high salinity environments and geothermal activities. And I was interested in seeing what kinds of insights could come out of making artworks that are the result of this interaction between the photomaterials and the elements and forces of natural phenomena. And then I think I just want to kind of mention here too, because of the sort of subject of this series, that new materialist philosophy and posthumanism have been really important ways for me to think through my practice. Both of these fields kind of overlap, and they're useful because they rework ideas of non-human agency and space-time matter and the relationship between nature, culture, and technology like photography. I'm going to kind of avoid getting too theoretical for the sake of time, and wanted this to be a bit more of a sort of artist talk. But I do just want to kind of talk about this idea of agency a little bit, because I think it's a really interesting way to rethink matter and open up kind of conceptual, historical, and theoretical possibilities of photomedia. So that idea of agency is traditionally centered on humanist ideas of subjectivity and power, where agency is actually something that's kind of possessed through intentionality. And instead, with this project, I'm kind of ascribing to this more amplified notion of agency, where it's more of a kind of material flux of multiplicitous becomings. It's kind of this never-ending state of becoming, and these enactments are expanded into the realm of the non-human, which is a really important point. And in this space, feminist studies scholar and theoretical physicist Karen Barad has a theory of agential realism, which is kind of key here because it emphasizes that, quote, matter doesn't refer to a fixed substance. Rather, matter is substance in its interactive becoming, not a thing, but a doing, a congealing of agency. So surfacing has two approaches to photomaterials. First, I worked with expired gelatin silver darkroom paper. You can see some of the boxes that I would have used here. And then later, I also worked with photographic films and printed on chromogenic paper in the color darkroom. And here I'm exposing the photographic paper to chemistry and heat and the moisture of steam vents. And that creates unpredictable forms and colors on the surface of the paper. And to do this involved what could be described as more than human, where, as new materialist writer Kaisa Konturi would say, the materialities involved have their own active role in the process, and they are not mastered by the artists alone. So these aesthetic traces that emerge through correspondences between the silver halide particles that are suspended in the gelatin on the surface of the paper and the chemical and temperature composition of the geothermal features, the UV rays from the sun, and the duration of contact, they're all sort of making these images. And I think in some ways this could be kind of considered a critically intimate approach to photomedia. I'm borrowing the term from Adrian Miles, who has used it as a counter to this idea of critical distance in documentary practice. And he says, quote, such intimacy obliges us to negotiate, consider, address, deal with, and wonder about the relational, active, agential, and relational complexity of real things in actual contexts. And I kind of would add to that it alludes to this idea of what's more than representational in these materials and in this media. So the other half of this project resembles a science fair project in a way. I collected lake water and submerged film into that. I should also mention the lake water was full of salt and algae and extremophile bacteria. And I let that sit for months on end and then just printed it as if it was a typical negative. So the image that you're seeing here is a piece of that film. And I thought what was interesting with this is that a different kind of time seemed to emerge onto the film. Felt like it was more of an earthly time as the salt crystals start to form and the emulsions breaking down. Here you can see that same section in the actual print. And in making the works, I was kind of taking up this more than human approach by being attentive to the agency of non-human elements and events. So both the natural phenomena, but also like within the photo materials. And I was trying to remove some of my human control in as much as I could in how that phenomena of an environment becomes represented or rendered in photography. I just wanted to just mention something that Joanna Zielinska discusses in her book, Non-Human Photography. She connects in a very material way photography to the processes of fossilization. And she argues that it's more than just this memory trace, but it's an actual material record of life. And I really like to think of these works as kind of amplifying that idea, because here the material conditions are incorporated with the materiality of the photograph in a way. And just wanted to also highlight, in that sense, the previous works, surfacing gelatin silver, with those, the imprints of the moisture and the heat on the photographic surfaces really look nothing like the pluming steam vents from where they were made. And so they kind of lack this visual register of what the landscape looked like. And instead, I would say both sets of these images are more of a visual emphasis of this idea that matter can be a congealing of agency. Just something quickly that I want to mention that I acknowledge in my practice is that the actual real materials of photography are derived from the earth itself. And media theorist Jussi Parikka explains that, quote, media history conflates with earth history. The geological materials of metals and chemicals get deterritorialized from their strata and reterritorialized in the machines that define our technical media culture. And so when we think deeply and consider this, we can kind of start to see how nature and culture and technology are actually entangled. So through this series, I'm kind of attempting to unsettle these conventions of landscape photography in a way, attempting to take something that normally depicts scenery and implies distance and instead kind of bring it a bit closer to kind of compress the distance by making photographs with rather than of the natural phenomena. All right, so the next project that I'll talk about is Echo, and this is the final project I did for my PhD. And as an artist working primarily in photography and video, I started to become more interested in how photomedia could be extended into spatialized forms, and started to experiment with a 3D scanner by testing out both the affordances and also the limitations of the technology when it comes to visually translating depictions of nature by scanning plants. So the works that I'll show today were scanned at Melbourne's Botanic Gardens, which is a place that's going to bring together plants from a variety of climates and ecosystems and geographic locations into one site. So because of that, it became kind of an ideal place to make this work, because I was able to make these botanical objects that were kind of untethered from a specific geographic environment. To make these, I used a structure sensor 3D scanner that's mounted onto an iPad, and it's operated by the app iSees 3D. And altogether, this technological framework translates the shape and texture and color through light and depth information that it receives. And it translates that into digital information. When the scanner with the app is used, this kind of funny message pops up, and it's basically cautioning against any outdoor use. And that's essentially because the light outdoors is really uncontrolled, and it exceeds the limits of the scanner. So this warning to not scan outdoors was, I'm assuming, added so to prevent people from operating it in conditions that are beyond the system's ability to produce aesthetically or representationally faithful 3D models. But for me, I actually was kind of interested in working at the margins of that framework, and I wanted to work against the accepted uses and procedures, partly because it could become a strategy to call in and bring in the conditions for the unforeseen within a system that's really meant to be accurate. So by taking that apparatus beyond its threshold, it actually depicted or created depictions that broke from kind of more standard pictorial versions that it was designed to. So I think this video is a little bit glitchy, but you should be able to kind of get a bit of a sense of the way that the 3D objects can be explored. So with this, that uncontrolled light, as I was scanning, and also the complex textures of the plants created these objects that become riddled with flaws and information gaps. And it's the depth, texture, color, and form of the plants with those intense kind of atmospheric conditions that create photons bouncing off of the floor. All of that's transformed. And it's moved from this plane of analog matter and force into this plane of digital materiality. Installed in the exhibition are the models. They're mounted onto touchscreen tablets. And then alongside those devices, I have the large video projected, which depicts the hand moving across the other botanicals. And I put this together in this way because I kind of wanted the larger projection to be sort of an instructional video almost for visitors that were going to the exhibition. They could kind of see that and understand that the models on the tablets were available to be manipulated. So with these scans, that translation process, which interprets the excessive photon data and the different plant forms, generates new forms and colors and textures that actually weren't present in the original plants. Some of them are missing structural information. They kind of look like they're eaten by insects. And others, the photographic textures of plants and surfaces can warp and stretch into weird, unidentifiable contours. So I just want to make the point that these glitch artifacts are basically indications of the failure of the media to actually disappear or to be transparent. And by making apparent that imaging system, I think that the artworks start to highlight the fact that photomedia representations are a construction. And that's sort of similar in the ways that Ambient Pressure, I was trying to draw attention to representational constructs of 2D images. For me, one of the aspects that's kind of most interesting about this is that it's the very energy input that's really fundamental to photomedia, which is light, is the same energy that basically brings the scanner to this brink of non-function. And it's the intensity that provides too much information, which I think is quite fascinating. So just in terms of kind of a little bit of thinking about this in terms of photo theory a little bit, the visual aberrations of echo, where these plant structures are kind of displaced and the colors bleed into each other, I sort of think that it points to this tangle of forces and materializations within the digital system. And for me, that implies that there's meaning in matter and this digital matter as much as there is in understandings that rely more on semiotics. And I think that's kind of suggestive of this more than representational possibility in photomedia. So that's something my project's trying to grapple with. And I think all of them are trying to kind of grapple with is this tension between the signifying aspects of photography and then the material configurations and sensations of photography. So in a similar way to surfacing, with this project, I'm trying to work with the agencies of the environmental conditions, like the intensity of the sun, and also the technology. And here I'm kind of more capitalizing off of the scanner's inability to accurately render these forms. And what I'm doing, I think, is kind of considerate that I'm enabling representational ruptures, whereas with ambient pressure, I was more overtly creating those ruptures. And making the artworks for Echo involved a kind of collaboration, I would say, between myself and the sensing technology. And in that process, there's kind of this unearthing of these imaging thresholds that reveal a sort of instability of data, all that glitching. And then that in turn highlights the instability of representation. So there's obviously a lot more that I could kind of say about this work. I won't really have time for it, but I did want to mention also the importance of engaging in an inquiry into the technological materials themselves, especially considering that this work is really focused on how nature comes to be represented through media. So for instance, regarding something like the LCD touchscreens with this Echo project, UC Parika provides a reminder. He says, quote, "The next time you swipe your screen with your index finger, remember that it also touches idiom," end quote. So these touchscreens are kind of intrinsically tied up with the materiality of the earth, and they're traces of what Parika calls the geophysical political implications of metal. So instead of assuming a kind of neutrality of materials and processes, I think it's important that we kind of advocate for an understanding of how political and environmental implications are tied up with the tools that we use. For all three of the projects, the strategies that I'm using are kind of non-standard, or I'm purposely misusing the tools. And all of this is kind of in the service of seeing and understanding nature and our relationship to it differently. And I would use this sort of term, staying with the trouble, as grounding the work a bit. Staying with the trouble was put forward by feminist studies scholar Donna Haraway. And it comes out of a frustration with two different ideas related to the Anthropocene. One is that, you know, we're going to be saved by technological fixes. And then the other is that taking sort of the position that it's too late and there's nothing more meaningful that we can be doing about our predicament. So Haraway points out that the word trouble comes from the French verb, which means to stir up or to make cloudy or to disturb. She says, our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. Staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or Slavic futures, but as moral critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings. And so my suggestion is that using photomedia of nature to kind of trouble itself can be a productive way to unfix and make visible some of the more problematic aspects of photographic framing. And so in my work, I'm trying to kind of trouble the conventional photographic representations and trouble our habitual ways of seeing nature through photomedia, while also kind of staying with the trouble of our environmental predicament in the way that Heatwave is just discussing it here. So I think my voice is about to give out, but I'm also going to finish my part of the presentation here. And so thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely phenomenal. I just wanted to say thank you very much for giving that talk. That's really fascinating. I'm now going to pass over to Rhona, but before I do, if you have any questions whatsoever, just put them in the chat and I will read them out after the talk by Rhona. So thank you, Rhona. If you'd like to start your presentation, that would be fun.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Rebecca. Great to see your work and so many resonances. Yeah, and I especially love the film work, the chromogenic. Yeah. Okay, so hi, I'm Rhona. Thanks all for being here. I'm just going to share my screen. Hang on a moment. You don't want to see that Franz Kafka quote, or maybe you do. Hang on a moment. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I was thinking about more than human photography in preparation for this talk, and yeah, and I found it really challenging. Actually, I just realizing that it's so forefront and so embedded in my practice that I was like, where do I begin? In a way, so I've been on a real journey, even just thinking about this talk actually, and then doing the Instagram takeover too, and yeah, it's made me really deeply reflect on my practice. So that's been yeah, really powerful. And I was thinking that I think that some of my more than human photography practices really began with these series that I made back in 2011. I had a photographic practice already, and I'd become really frustrated actually with, so when I first got into film, I started taking photographs when I was 10 and writing when I was 9. So photography and writing have always been really interconnected for me. And so I first came to photography when film was the default, and then I saw it move into the digital. And when it moved into the digital, I noticed that I became really frustrated with the perfectionism of it, of how I could take a photograph, immediately see it. If it wasn't quite right, I delete it, you know, start over. And this was just so different to the practice that I was familiar with of making a work, having a gap between making and seeing, and something kind of almost condensing, if you like, or processing in that gap, like internally as well as externally. And so then by the time I saw the work, yeah, something had already occurred for me. So if that makes sense. And so I got so frustrated with these perfectionist techniques that I was just like, get rid, like really kind of, and sort of angry with kind of Digital Photographer Monthly. And I'd worked in photo labs, and I'll talk more about that later. But I instead wanted more dynamism really in my practice. And so I started, I mean, I continued working, I'd already continued been working with film, but I decided to like work much more experimentally, much more directly, much more physically with the materials. And so this work started in Dungeness, where I had a kind of, it was almost, I grew up in Kent, so it was almost like my second home for a long time. And so and I loved working in Dungeness because for people who don't know about it, it's this remote, it's I think it has the largest shingle bed in the whole of Europe. And it's this spit of land that juts out into the sea. And so it's this remote landscape where the ratio of non-humans to humans is much higher. And so I guess there's a place that gives, there's a sense of wildness, there's a sense of it being dominated by the elements. And Derek Jarman, the artist, he decided to set up a home there. And so I was used to making work in Dungeness and going on these kind of wild walks at night. And what I noticed was that as a woman, it was allowing me to really reclaim darkness and night, which I'd culturally learned that darkness was not a space that was safe for me to occupy. And I'd actually become quite afraid of the darkness and afraid of I'm incredibly sensitive. I'm the first to admit I'm a wuss. and actually I made this whole series of works about darkness to almost overcome that fear and use this fear almost as a guide, if that makes sense. And in doing so, the work became very sensually charged for me, because because I was afraid, I was really operating from instinct. And because I was operating from instinct, it meant that all my senses were really alive. And I noticed that by taking out the sense of sight, of course, all my other senses came up and turned up their volume in order to compensate. So these works were made on black and white paper and with a torch, actually, in Derek Jarman's garden at night. And I was thinking about this space. It wasn't sort of trying to capture like the spirit of Derek or anything kind of like that. It was more that it was a charged space for me, and I'd already had this relationship with the photograph as an object, as a charged space. And so I wanted to kind of pair those through my methods, if that makes sense. So these works then led me, a few years later, I was doing an art residency in Australia, and I did some works in the bush where I made photograms with fire. And I was working with a landscape which had been affected by bushfires, and I was really fascinated by the trees, because the trees were in this really strange state of having very charred bark, but then internally something else was obviously going on, because they also had these fresh green leaves. And so I wanted to understand, and I was fantasizing that I could get somehow photographically and collaboratively with the tree, that I could get underneath the skin and get inside and climb inside this kind of mind of the tree, if you like. And as I was making these works, I set up this kind of makeshift darkroom. And so again, I decided to collapse the space actually between making and seeing in this instance. And I noticed, for instance, in this work, that when I made the work, all of a sudden I was like, oh, what's that, when it was developing in the developing tray. And I realized that the marks you can see here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, they were actually, they're sort of by the top of this right angle. That's actually the charcoal from the tree. So I got this sense of the surface of the paper, and then also the internals of the paper, and I fantasized I could enter the internals of the tree. When I was at the Slade, I was able to, having access to a darkroom a lot of the time, I was able to really extend and expand my practice. And I made this work, Mother Night Go Into Her Totally, which was a series of really large photograms where I took a whole roll of photographic paper. So it was, I think this work in the end was like 2 meters by 1 meter, or even over that. I can't remember the dimensions exactly, but, and I then displayed them in an exhibition, an exposed art gallery in High Street, Kensington, in a group show that was talking about ghosts, actually. And what I was really wanting there, again, my mother's garden, it has a really charged, strong psychological space for me, and I almost wanted to be able to I wanted the photograph to kind of almost be able to kind of pick up and psychically be able to hold some of the experiences that I'd had in that space. As I look back on some of my practice, I realized these works, which were just pieces that I tore off from different photograms that I'd made. And it was almost like an evidence of an encounter with myself, where I hadn't realized my hand had been revealed in the making. And as I look back, I realize now that I was already working with the body in relationship with the paper, but at the time this was quite unconscious. The work Contact and the following work, Lunar Observations in Decent Rays, were works I made whilst I was living in New Zealand. And this was a work I made in relationship with an eclipse. So for the duration of eclipse, I exposed a raw roll of film to the night sky. And I wanted to, I didn't know even if it would come out, to be honest. I didn't know if it would work at all, but I'd received the idea as an intuition, and I wanted to follow it and see what would emerge. And you can see it in more detail here. There's these kind of strange cosmic shadows on the film. And this is a single frame. And I named it this as when X-rays were first invented, there was a lot of suspicion from the Victorians. There was a lot of suspicion about what these rays might reveal of the self. This is myself working with 16mm film. I extended the photogramming to 16mm film, and I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand how the moving image as well as the still might work with my body. And I wrapped my body in 16mm film, and then I hand processed the film. And I again did exposures with fire. I was interested in working with fire, particularly because I wanted to understand. Well, I guess I think of growing up a hippie, I very much learned that nature and the natural world had its own agency and its own realm that I existed in mutuality with, that I had total and deep respect for. It was very similar, and I realize now, akin to indigenous understandings of the planet, and also New Age understandings of the planet, where agency and mind and body are and power are given to elements other than human. And in that, it argues for states of care and practices of care and nurturing, which have always, to me, just felt incredibly right and aligning. And so I wrapped my body in 16mm film using fire. And I was thinking of fire as being its own, and nature as having its own image generating qualities. And I was interested in what these other images that weren't of me, that weren't from me, and that were created in some kind of collaborative sense, so that there was a loss of self. I found that when I worked in photography, initially in photography labs, that photography was very egotistical and very cerebral and very patriarchal. And I found this really frustrating. I found that it was very non-bodily. And this was, to me, I'm such an emotional, sensitive, feeling person that this was just quite alien to me. And I wanted to know how to be able to connect with these materials and these practices in a way that worked with me. And here's some of the chemical residue in it. And for me, some of the chemical residue on the film almost became like a bodily fluid. And I named the work "The Body Keeps the Score" after a classic trauma text, looking at which acknowledges cellular memory and the power of our histories to be embedded in our bodies. So this is some of my history. I worked in photography labs, like I was saying, and also studied psychology at the same time. So there's always been this interconnectedness in my practice between photography and psychology. I worked in Snappy Snaps, first of all, where I learned how to look at this terrible 90s hand. I found these on Google the other day. Then I worked in Jessop's in New Oxford Street, and then I worked in Joe's Basement. And all of these places, I were like photographic community, and what I realized as well, that this, especially Jessop's, was believe it or not, despite its innocent exterior, it was a hotbed of sexual activity. And so I realized that there was something for me again, about photography and instinct and getting underneath things, getting underneath the surface of things. So these works connected to that, and I had this fantasy that I could get underneath the skin or into the mind of the world's oceans. And so I made a series of works where I developed photographs in relationship with different oceans. And this was inspired by the Stanislaw Lem book Solaris, where he thinks of a planet, the planet Solaris, as this cosmic yogi, as this mind that is able to blend and join with his own mind. This practice again extended with a work I created at Black Mountain College, in North Carolina in the States, and I worked with the members of the Asheville darkroom. I actually lived in North Carolina and I'd used the darkroom a lot there. So I already had a relationship with that community. And then I decided to return when I was no longer living there and make this work, and made this work in relationship with the lake. And Black Mountain College has been a huge influence on my practice. Black Mountain College, in case you don't know about it, was a college that existed from, I think it was from 1933 to 1957. And it was a really seminal college in terms of bringing together drawing, dance, gardening, choreography, painting, singing, really placing photography in a much more expanded relationship with other disciplines, because I often get frustrated by photography's isolationist nature. And so for me, both my parents were painters in the 60s. And so I grew up very much thinking about photography and painting and drawing and movement and gesture all being together in a continuous interdisciplinary dialogue. And for me, that acknowledges much more of a healthy and equal relationship with the natural world as well. So science fiction has been a continual influence on my practice, and I made these works starting to explore notions of hybridity in discarded spaces. This was discarded and abandoned, again, isolated spaces where glass had been forgotten. And this was an exhibition I did in relationship with Lumen Bow and Raw Labs, of which Melanie was present at, yeah. And I made these works, excuse me, I showed these works in slide viewers so that people actually had to move their body they had to leave their own world in order to access these other worlds that I'd temporarily created. And they were hybrid spaces between humans and non-humans, this where grass and moss and condensation had gathered underneath pieces of glass, and they felt almost like a kind of a double lens that I was gazing through. I also led a reading group alongside that, so we explored different texts, different science fiction texts in relationship to climate and speculative fiction. And I love speculative fiction because it acknowledges art's agency and culture's agency and power for creating and sustaining possible new futures. I really believe in the role of imagination in creating new futures, and I think it allows for us to see solutions that we otherwise wouldn't see. So last year I edited Vector, which is a critical journal of the Science Fiction Association, and wrote an article with Stephanie Moran where we were talking about the power of collaboration and ecofeminism as a way forward, and practices acknowledging dreaming and art as a sketchbook, really, for envisioning new ways of being. So I started to become, like I said, I felt frustrated with the photograph in many ways, as I'm sure you can sense, and its limits and its surface, and it's also its neutrality and its allegiance to colonialism, actually, where it often pretends that it's this, I've got this, I'm just this neutral object, I'm not from anywhere, I can go anywhere. And so I made a number of works where I tried to really land the works into specific landscapes. So at this work, I visited Denmark, where I was actually a tourist, and then I pretended to be a tourist, taking photographs at the Little Mermaid site. And then, pretending to be a tourist, I then took the photographs that I made and I pressed them into relationship with the landscape. So here you can see I put seaweed, I rubbed seaweed all over the pictures, I scratched them on the rocks, and I tried to bring the photograph into relationship with the actual land that it was made in. Similarly, with this series, I put sand and sea. I had to get my camera cleaned afterwards. Seawater, bits of palm tree inside these landscapes, inside these tourist landscapes that I was in. So this is my degree show where I wrote a book of poems about our relationship with the classical elements, bringing ourselves much more into somatic relationship with the planet. And then I had performances and installations, and I sort of I activated each installation space with a performance. So here's one of the performances where I speak about my own autobiographical relationship with water. And I often draw upon my own autobiography to then hopefully instill and inspire you to connect with your own autobiography, your own relationship with water, because I'm aware that one of the ways that metabolic rift and capitalism operates in our current society is that we have this total disconnectedness from the elements. You know, fire is delivered via radiators, waterfalls are delivered through showers, etc., etc. And so what happens when we foreground the elements instead is that then we actually start to begin to appreciate them and acknowledge them. So these were black and white acetates that but they were black and white photocopies originally that I made into acetates, and then I did a performance activating each of the acetates. Working with Polaroid as well. I really enjoy the relationship of Polaroid to painting and how there's that blurring between those distinctions. And so it's unclear whether the images are made by hand or whether they're made by machine. And this was a work I made. I was living in an artist cooperative where the bathroom wall was starting to disintegrate and completely dismantle the boundary between the garden and the bathroom. And so I started to document this process through Polaroid. And I had this really conflicted relationship because, of course, the hippie in me wants to exist in this world where there is no boundarylessness between me and other bodies. And yet at the same time, I was noticing my sense of disgust when kind of flies and insects and all these other things, all these other creatures were coming into the bathroom, and all my classic sense of femininity was being challenged. So I was fascinated by that conflict. In 2019, as I was graduating from the Slade, I was invited to co-curate an exhibition with another artist called Leah Collette. And we co-curated this exhibition, Your Mulchy Green, Your Verdant Matter. So we turned the Slade, which is an art college, in case you don't know, we acknowledged it as an ecosystem, as a space of creativity and of vitality. And we held a series of public-facing events, including a foraging walk and also a writing poetry session and plant hybridity session and propagation. And yeah, it was very dynamic. And what I really noticed was that all of the events sold out and people just were so hungry for more. And the exhibition itself was an ecofeminist botanical exhibition, acknowledging again our bodily connection to the earth. So I thought I'd speak specifically about some works, in particular, I'll start with this work. If I Eat You, Will We Both Still Be Okay? So this was a series of films that I made whilst on residency with Lumen in 2019. We went to Lizard Point in Cornwall and we were introduced to this little lens, and I had adventures with this lens crawling across this field in Cornwall. And what I wanted to do was I'm so aware that a lot of the patriarchal colonial gaze is maintained through hierarchy. And a lot of the destructiveness that we've caused to the planet has come through this notion of hierarchy, that we're somehow better or superior to or more important than non-human worlds. And so I wanted to literally collapse my own hierarchy physically by rather than having my head up here and the non-human world of plants and insects down there, I instead put myself onto my belly and crawled across this field on my stomach. And so I was pushing for a relationship between my body and the somatic and being led by feeling rather than being led by thought. And so when I show this work, I show it as a series of different films on screens laid on top of one another, again, almost like their bodies, or kind of almost like looking down into an aquarium. And I'll show you a clip of the film now. I'm just going to change screens, so just bear with me for a moment. Oh, hang on a moment, sorry.
Hi, we can't actually see the...
Sorry, just it told me. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I'm dyspraxic. I find it really hard to share screens. Hang on a
No
moment.
worries at all, just letting you know.
Thanks so much. Hang on a moment. I can hear it, but I can't see it.
Yeah, same.
I'm just going to find it. I can't see any of your, yeah, hang on a moment. So, share screen. Great. It's nice to watch that. It might help me to slow down, actually, so that's great. Yeah, and when I was making that work, I'll just keep sharing the PowerPoint, but as I was making that work, it was like going on a journey in itself. Like it did actually mean spending a lot of time with that field and in that space. And similar to what Rebecca was saying in terms of, I really related around the pushing of technologies and pushing against the limits of the technology and the limits of the machine, and pushing the buttercups and the plants and the bugs like into the housing and of the lens, and then all this pollen came inside the lens, and yeah, it felt like it was pushing for intimacy and encouraging an intimacy. And I noticed it sensually too as well, you know, having my face squashed into dew and squashed into plants and the smell and the sense, and my body physically moving across the grass and noticing how the field changed at different times of the day. Just the very practice of making gave me an entirely different experience of the landscape. So I'll just continue to share. So I'm going to share a different work now called Heatwave, which draws on similar themes in terms of using my body and the relationship between body, plant, and machine. So I'm going to read you a text which talks about my practice of making, and if you're welcome to close your eyes if you'd like. I'm interested in language's ability to generate images and the difference between images that are generated in our mind and the images that we see externally. I'm just going to read you a short text. Heatwave. Last summer, as usual, I swam in the Hampstead Ladies' Ponds, a local familiar haunt of mine, but this time, under the guise of COVID-19, once free water was now regulated by a land grab from the Corporation of London and a bolted-on booking system, forcing women shoulder to shoulder in a scarce race to get tickets. I didn't know whether I'd be a traitor by swimming, like the decision of whether to visit the human or the robot in the supermarket checkout queue. My northern working class family reminding me of the need to keep people in work, and so I tend to queue up for human interaction. But that day I went. I knew I wouldn't be returning for some time as I felt uncomfortable with the changes. And so when a perfect round ellipsis of water lily, unmoored from stems, was there floating seductively, it felt inevitable, and my hand reached out before me. Secretly sliding the disc down inside my swimming costume, water, breast, torso, and lily pad conjoining, my solar plexus suddenly bathed in green. Changing in the field afterwards, I quietly carried the lily pad out of there, upright and flat in my bag, pressed amongst books, food, paper, and water. Once home, I gave it its own bowl of water on the table, its own warm pool to bathe in. You see, I wanted to keep it alive to work with. But in the morning, and as the days passed, its colour changed, green smoothness creeping into brown, its firm edges crinkling, then softening, soon transmuting into viscous plant tissue, thickened water. As the temperature continued to rise outside, I realised I had to act. Laying the lily pad across my hands, I carried it with me upstairs to the studio. I wanted the triangle of plant body machine, a trio I often use to transcend. Undressing then, I pressed myself up against the screen of the photocopier. Half aware of the neighbours, half not caring, I pushed the smushed lily pad into my mouth and into my face and pressed the button on the printer as I writhed. I was shocked. The plant smelt of the pond had a strong acrid scent that I hadn't anticipated. Assumed it had become more human by staying with me, and it hit my nostrils, pulling me away when so much of me was pulling closer. I felt simultaneously compelled and revolted, its green-brown body disintegrating as I worked, the stem flattened, melted against my lips. My tongue evidently a stronger muscle than plant fibre cut off from its root. My boobs and torso were hot in the heat wave, yet cooled by the contact. I felt high, laughing at the scene as if I gazed through the eyes of an outside observer. The grossness, the hilarity, the stringy, gloopy sexual mess the botanics in me left on the scanner screen. Ecstatic to experience such a merging, I added blossom from the windowsill, begonia, leaves from the flamingo plant, both surprised to be invited to such a party. The printer photocopier lumbered in such heat, soon feeling like an old man or someone's uninvited husband, unable to keep up, as my body squirmed over and over, wanting to rinse the lily pad and plants of their contents, wanting to get inside and fully occupy, and know their minds and bodies as well as I know my own. I wanted to climb inside the photocopier too, fantasized I could get underneath the glass and peep through its green eye, fit my body neatly inside its rigid black plastic housing. It remained obtuse, somehow out of reach, like it couldn't be persuaded from its task. Undeterred, I accessed other intimacies through the felt state of melting, succumbing to sweaty atmospherics as our distinct bodies pooled into boundarylessness. Meanwhile, the black and white paper piled up on the studio floor. Only half recognizing myself, they felt like marks made, film stills or evidence of encounter, rather than images I'd just made. It took me some time to come back to center. So here are some of the images that were generated in that experience. So the whole series is called Heatwave. Yeah, so with, I'm just going to see if there's anything else I wanted to say about Heatwave really. Yeah, well, again, it was thinking about where images are generated actually, and wanting to surrender and to succumb and to listen. Listening feels like a really important part of my practice. Again, I think growing up a hippie, I learned to go into nature or the natural world and listen and just be with it. And I love the writings of the psychologist Eric Fromm, who talks about being other than doing, and about how being immersed in capitalism, how we are taught to become kind of robots really that endlessly do. And so I think of being, and especially being in the body, as an act of subversion in itself. So I'll speak about this work now, which is a work I made in relationship with geysers. Since 2018, I've been in a postal dialogue with artist Berglind Hreirsdottir, who is an Icelandic artist now based in Sweden. And at the start of our dialogue, they were still based in Iceland. And we've been in a postal exchange, and then we've also met in person in Iceland. I've got an ongoing relationship with Iceland. I was obsessed with Iceland as a teenager. I grew up in Kent, in a really mainstream, humdrum, boring town where I felt hideously out of place, coming from a hippie artist family. And Iceland to me seemed like this place. It was before it was cool. It was only when kind of geologists were interested in it. And I used to go to the library obsessively over and over again, getting these same 2 books out. Yeah, and so I always had this fantasy that Iceland would be a place that I would be understood. And that actually has been my experience. And I first visited there in the late 1990s with some record and music friends of mine. And then later have returned, and I've been doing this dialogue with Berglind, and we're due to do a symposium actually, which I'll invite you to in a moment. So this was the research I was doing around geysers, and when I visited Iceland most recently with Berglind, we actually had an encounter with geysers, and we went and visited some of these tourist sites, and we were asking how could we be in the country and not be tourists. I'm just going to check my time. Yeah, I'm just starting to wrap up. And so I was thinking about geysers, even before the Iceland dialogue, to be honest. I've been thinking about the mouth and working with the mouth as a site of knowing, thinking about how as children we so often put things in our mouths, and it's a sense of getting to grips with a notion of the other. Because I think with more than human photography, for me, so much is about understanding and grappling with the other, and how do we not experience the other as an alien? How do we recognize ourselves in the other and the other in ourselves? Yeah, anyway, both way around. And so I was already thinking about volcanoes and geysers and mouths as sites of openings, sites of opening in the body and sites of knowing. And so I started the research photographically and in person. And Berglind and I had this encounter with a geyser where we got completely rained on and completely drenched, and then we were sort of stinking of this sulfur water. And then so I started off by doing, and then I did these small watercolors. I was just thinking about the kind of sort of insane notion really of being able to fix and freeze a geyser, which is inherently for me alive and potent and vital. And when I lived in New Zealand, geysers and these geothermal spaces are often connected with sacred lands, which makes complete sense to me. So this is a symposium that's taking place on the 11th of June. If you'd like to come, it's free. You can find the details on my social media, and we'll be talking about Iceland and art and music and people, artists and musicians' continual fascination with Iceland and distance and more than humanness. And it's similar. I thought you might be interested. And then I think I'll share finally with just a short clip of my film connected to geysers, if that's okay. I'm just going to set it up and then I'll share my screen. I'm going to stop there. Yeah, and I made the work with found postcards from eBay and then combined it with breathing sounds of the body, in case you're wondering what that strange soundtrack was. Great, thanks. I hope something of what I've shared reaches you. Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rhona. That was so exciting and inspiring. I'm really inspired by both of your talks. I'm going to read out some of the questions now. So the first one is from Nicola Dixon to both of you. And she says, do you both have advice for someone who is working in this more alternative way? Also, having to stand my ground in a male-dominated course, I'm being expressive and conceptual, but feel it's hard for the male staff to understand. Have you had this in your own practice, Rebecca and Rhona? So Rebecca, would you like to start? Yeah.
I can start, sure. Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I feel like when I think about sort of my undergrad experience, I was always sort of doing the weird stuff in a fairly traditional program. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like there was definitely moments where I was kind of questioning myself, but I think I was lucky to have at least, you know, some professors who kind of were open to what I was up to. So it does help to have that. I'm just struggling trying to give you some like solid advice. So I might see if Rhona has anything to add, and I'll have a little think if I've got kind of more to give you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for that question. Yeah, and I think it is, for me, it's important that kind of men don't become the problem in a way, that they don't become another other that I then start to alienate myself from. I'd say that for me, the issue is patriarchy and notions of tradition and dominance and what's termed in trauma theory as ladder thinking, which is when we either think of ourselves as either less than or more than, rather than equal to. Yeah, so I just want to say that first of all. Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think I really relate, just to say, you know, when, especially, you know, as you probably heard when I was talking about my history of working in photography labs, I totally had that experience, and I often felt very patronized, and I'd get very sort of angry and yeah, frustrated by it. Yeah, so the things, anyway, sorry, I'll get to the solution. So what I would suggest personally is finding like-minded souls. That's what I've always done. That's what's always helped me. Like, I've sought out like-minded souls. And I think one of the amazing upsides of COVID is how online we all are now, and so that means that whatever course you're doing, you know, even if it is in some far-flung suburb of somewhere, you can still stay connected to everybody. And so I would, yeah, I've worked with great mentors. I've worked with I've stayed connected to people who speak the same language as me, and I've sought them out and I've stayed close to them, and you know, whether they're in the form of books or music or culture or actual, you know, or actual people or friends, or yeah, and then I found that staying close to that like-mindedness has then generated in me a sense that what I'm creating and that my voice has worth, and yeah, is worth my valuing. And then I don't have a tendency to make that professor into some, you know, authority. Or, you know, I mean, obviously, of course, they matter because you're on the course, and you know, you need to pay attention to what they're teaching, etc. But they're not your, you know, essentially they're kind of, I'd say in spiritual terms, like they're not your higher power, right? They're not, you know, your sense of worth or your sense of well-being doesn't need to come from that person. It needs to come from inside. So I think it's very easy, I know, when I was at art college, just to get really sucked into like bullshit approval seeking, basically, that I think just like runs so much of the art world. And I think the more we can move on from that, like the better, because then we can actually make the work that we're meant to make, and then the world changes, right? Yeah, otherwise we're just all in, you know, just a self-referential, masturbatory, very tiny world that nobody wants to visit. Yeah.
We have another question. Oh,
Oh, I
Rebecca,
was
do you want to
going to
say?
add to that a little bit. I thought, yeah, I mean, there was a lot said that I think was so helpful. I guess I was just sort of thinking about, like a general shift from these sort of thinking about the world in a very sort of like structured, systematic way, like as if there's this like underlining structure, things are easy to understand if we just sort of look at it in a particular way. And I think part of it to me is about this kind of turn towards different ways of knowing and being in the world. And I think like if perhaps it's sort of about you being kind of clear with where you are in that space, and kind of owning that and kind of knowing also like, hey, this is what's sort of happening in art and photography. Like some of the new ideas that are coming in are embracing these different ways of knowing and making. And that's actually a progressive, interesting thing. So I'll just throw that out there too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask a question from Yas Crawford, which is to Rhona. You mentioned the painterly effects Polaroid to painting. Do you consider your work to be art, fine art, or other? And I think that could apply to Rebecca as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but let's both speak to it. Yeah, if you'd like to respond as well, Rebecca. Yeah, I think of it as art. Yes, yeah. I mean, I think that I think before, yeah, I mean, there's an interesting kind of tension anyway, isn't there, between like, I'm a photographer and I'm an artist, which I'm all for updating as well, same as everything else. Yeah, so I think of it as art because, yeah, for me, things need to feel open and fluid, and because then that allows for dialogue. I think I think that academia in particular was really damaged when there was a cleaving between art and science, and I'm a huge fan of the bringing together of those, because really essentially it's human experience, isn't it, that we're speaking of. Yeah, and self-expression.
Yeah, I would say I definitely think of what I do as art, and using, partly I think because I feel like, I mean, both Rhona and I are sort of challenging kind of photography in many ways. And so it's using the medium, but it's not necessarily like identifying as, a photographer. I guess that's sort of how I see it. And then it's also, there's an openness to, different processes and materials. And yeah, it's funny, I was looking at your overhead projectors, Rhona, in one of your performances, and that's something that I've also used. I mean, I think it's about it being kind of open to what kind of materials will not say what you want to say, but maybe it's the right material to kind of explore with a particular question or idea that you're sort of interested in investigating, so to speak.
Yeah, there needs to be a conceptual match, doesn't there? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I think Polaroid was really it was really the right thing at the time, because of that blurring and that sense of like, because I think when there's a blurring, what I've noticed is that when there's a blurring, we can't immediately grasp what it is, and in that lack of being able to initially grasp what it is, we look more, we have to engage more, and in that engaging more, there's more of an psychological internal inquiry that takes place. You've got that person's attention for longer, and I think that's often the way with a lot of these experimental approaches, is that they allow us to question how, question our making practices through that longer gaze.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a question from Jem Toes Christian, who says, these films are so wonderfully immersive. I think this is in response to your Lying on Your Belly film.
Oh, yeah.
She was wondering how you made them. Was it a hand lens?
Yeah, well, you can speak to that, Melanie, can't you? Because it was you that provided the lens. It was a iPhone adapter lens that you'd bought, wasn't it? That was really inexpensive. Yeah, and it was that, and then it was just me shoving loads of buttercups and pushing it, not quite breaking it. I'm happy to say, but near, yeah, seeing, come on, like, what can you do? What's possible for you to do? Yeah, and shoving it, and I was also, I had the camera like really close to my face, so it was almost like it became, it sort of temporarily became part of my body. So there was, I think you're getting that sort of sense with it as well. I have seen other people making works with it because the circle kind of is a distinctive shape.
Yeah, I think it was a microscope lens, like adapter thing for yeah, it's really fun to work with. I have another question from Mylena, which is to you again, Rhona. And she says, are those still photos of are those still photos of frames from a film? And she's responding to your Gazers film.
Oh yeah. There are postcards. They're postcards I got from eBay. So I was interested in how, at the time, I was thinking about, because I made the work the end of last year, the beginning of this year, I think. Time's blurred, hasn't it? Because I was wanting to make more work with geysers, and obviously I could, because of COVID, I couldn't make them. I couldn't go there. There isn't any geysers in Britain, unfortunately, and so I was thinking about how geysers and sort of exotic non-human sites are sort of translated and held in other ways. And I was like, well, how else can I get at these? And I think eBay is just such a fascinating space, like in itself. but then especially for kind of finding these other representations of things. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And I have a question as well, which is something that I struggle with. But how do you reconcile the use of photographic materials? So yeah, for example, like using silver gelatin papers or things like that. And that's a question to both of you.
You want to speak first, Rebecca? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out. I think that's what I was kind of pointing to, that it's sort of about it's about kind of acknowledging it and discussing it and investigating it and kind of figuring out, what are the impacts of the use. And so, yeah, for me, I think I'm kind of at that stage where I'm more sort of like thinking about it in a different way than I had before, and probably, in a different way than when I was producing that work with the silver gelatin paper, for instance. So it's interesting to kind of think about where we might go with these conversations, I think. And also it's particularly with digital media, it's quite a prominent discussion. I think importantly, especially with like the impacts of just sort of like NTF, not for blockchain kind of like mining, and like what's required actually to constantly sort of like host, I guess, that artwork. I don't know how exactly to frame that, but look, I think it's just kind of a discussion, and I'm wanting to be a part of it and wanting to kind of look back at my practice and what I plan to do in the future, and sort of be much more cognizant about what that means and what are the impacts. So no answers.
Yeah, I'll answer too. Yeah, great question, and thanks for bringing it in. And I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing around the sustainable darkroom, actually, because I think it is so. When I used to work in labs and stuff, and we were just pouring tons of fixer down the drain, and I'd just be like thinking about all these frogs, just like, oh God, what are we doing? Yeah, I think it's really vital. Yeah, I mean, I think some of that has contributed to me working less with photographic materials, like as directly as I used to be honest, because it doesn't feel in alignment with my values and integrity. And so I have been making a lot more work from archive. But yeah, even the same, like you're saying, Rebecca, like I think for me, there's also the thing of, of digital impact, like all these servers, even, I wrote a poem once about the element of air, and in that I was writing about kind of data and storage, and like, yeah, all these servers sitting deserts, kind of remote places where we're just, I think we don't know the impact of all of this yet. I think the digital is a huge thing that we need to consider the footprint of as well. I remember, I'll tell you this story. Like, I remember once I watched this documentary about the mining of particular minerals for the batteries of mobile phones, and how it was contributing to particular civil wars, particularly in Africa. And I was so dismayed by this. I was like, I'm never upgrading my phone. And I remember that the phone company called me like that week or 2 weeks later or something, saying like, hi, Miss Clews, would you like your phone upgraded? And I was like, well, actually, I don't, because I don't want to contribute to civil war in Africa. And I think they just never phoned me again. I think they probably just put nutter on my file. Just like, but like, I think, that kind of, that was ages ago, but like, it's we're taught in the West, we're taught to just like absolutely not consider, not think about any of those things, and just be consumers instead, and just try and get everything as cheaply as we can. With no thought of the line, where the lineage where it's coming from, no thought of the land, no thought of the people, the labour, any of it, and all of that needs to become conscious. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's been an incredibly fascinating talk today, and we've had lots of great comments in the chat as well, saying how wonderful your works are. So I think because there's no questions, we'll leave it there. But yeah, thank you so much. That was so exciting and brilliant. And thank you all for coming.
That was fun. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for asking us. Thanks so much. Lovely to connect with the community.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.